Good afternoon. In today's conversation on Europe, we're taking a step away from the political issues that have been the subject of our last few sessions, like the rise of the right, international climate change negotiations, the migration crisis. And today we're turning to the world of art and culture, to museums and auction houses, to explore the political, legal, and ethical issues that have informed the ongoing debates over repatriation and restitution of artworks and other cultural heritage objects. In a sense, we're asking the big questions of, should museums return cultural relics? In which cases should they do so, and to whom? Just to give a bit of background and by way of introduction, we'll start with last year. In 2015, the British Museum opened a special exhibit of Australian Aboriginal art, which created a great deal of protest among activists in Australia. The artifacts were seen by those activists as looted cultural property from the colonial era. Protesters complained in particular that the items on display had been originally collected by imperial occupiers who were looking to document the inferiority of indigenous peoples. Not only were they taken, they were then curated and interpreted by Western elites for Western audiences. And this was sort of the source of the grievance. The argument was that they should be returned to Australia. The British Museum has, of course, been the object of other highly publicized claims, most famously the Parthenon marbles, which are sometimes called the Elgin marbles. These sculptures were extracted from the Parthenon and expatriated to Britain in 1801 by Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, and the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, which was occupying Greece. The British government purchased the marble sculptures from him in 1816, and they've been housed in the British Museum ever since. Now, the British Museum argues that they were legally acquired. The Ottoman Sultan had given Lord Elgin permission to remove anything from the Parthenon, as long as it didn't destroy the structural integrity. Greece, on the other hand, argues that they should be returned to the Parthenon Museum, to the context in which they were created and for which they were originally intended. And they argue that as an occupier, the Sultan had no authority over the Parthenon in the first place to be allowing the destruction of these works of art. The Greeks argue that the Parthenon marbles belong to Greece as a part of their national cultural heritage. The British argue that they're part of a universal cultural heritage that museums can preserve. And they make another counterclaim that if all ancient art were returned, the collections of European museums would be decimated. Probably the most prominent proponent or most vocal spokespeople for the argument against repatriation is James Cuno, who is the president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust. He's argued that the role of museums like the Met in New York, the Louvre in Paris, and the British Museum in London, and I'm placing them for a pretty specific reason, is to allow visitors to experience the varieties of culture across time and across space in one visit, to promote a cosmopolitan worldview. He argued in an article in Foreign Affairs in December of 2014, quote, "Cultural property should be recognized for what it is, the legacy of humankind, and not of the modern nation state, subject to the political agenda of its current ruling elite." End quote. Yet advocates of repatriation restitution argue that there is a moral imperative to return materials. Moral values can sometimes distinguish some cultural objects from others, and those particular objects should be returned to the claimant groups. They argue that the physical context in which those objects were created is important to better understanding them, and they often argue that the national interests in objects that were created and unearthed within a nation's borders make for a stronger claim than those defended by a few major museums, which, they claim, are merely anachronistic institutions, relics of imperialism. So there's a lot going on. And to help us explore this debate and help sort out the many issues that come up when you start talking about it, we've assembled a panel of distinguished experts. I want to introduce them now before we begin. Dr. Sophie Vigneron, who is joining us from the UK, is a senior lecturer in law at the Kent Law School. She specializes in European and comparative law, with a particular interest in the regulation of the art market and cultural heritage law. Her current research assesses the efficiency of existing export restrictions and restitution laws at the international, European, and national levels, and how those laws relate to private law and public international law. So I'll be turning to her with questions about law, as you might guess. Her earlier work has also focused on the regulation of cultural objects and restitution of stolen and or illegally exported cultural objects, in particular in the case of historic wrongs. So hopefully we'll be getting to those questions as well. Dr. Neil Brodie, also joining us in the UK, works with the Trafficking Cultures Project based at the University of Glasgow and funded by the European Research Council, which is now an international research consortium. He also maintains a very useful blog on the cultural, criminal, and economic aspects of the illicit trade in cultural objects, which you can find at www.marketmassdestruction.com. He's an archaeologist by training and has held positions at the British School at Athens, the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge, where he was the research director of the Illicit Antiquities Research Center, Stanford University's Archaeology Center, and the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at the University of Glasgow. Thanks for joining us. Joining us with the cooperation of the EU Centre at the University of Illinois, Dr. Susan Frankenberg is the program coordinator for the Museum Studies program in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. A cultural and medical anthropologist, she's published a number of articles related to paleodemography and other techniques that relate to the understanding of prehistoric peoples and societies. And before coming to the University of Illinois and working with their Museum Studies program, she was the curator of archaeology at the University of Tennessee. And then joining me here on my left, here at the center, is Dr. Aaron Peters, who's a joint lecturer in curatorial studies in the history of art and architecture, and assistant curator of science and research in the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. She is particularly interested in the disparate ways Egypt is collected and displayed across institutions. And her research has focused on temples built in Egypt under the first Roman Emperor Augustus. I'm so grateful to you all for joining us. Welcome. And I'm not going to ramble on for too much longer. I'd like to kick off the discussion with a bit of background before we wade too deeply into the weeds. Let me set it up by going back to the Parthenon marbles where we began. Interestingly, they made Time magazine's list of top 10 plundered artifacts, which the fact that such a list exists, that people would be giving a top 10 list, is just one example of the kind of mediatization and the publicity that this debate has garnered. Most particularly in recent movies made in the US, in Europe, in China, they've brought to light and to the public attention on the issues of the illicit trade in art, restitution claims, and the rights of claimants. So to start, I want to ask you sort of broadly to start setting up the background for us. So I'm going to ask you first, you get the honor of the first question because you're sitting right next to me. So how big is this debate and what kinds of things are we really talking to? Is it just a couple of works of art and some antiquities? And what do we call them if it's not just works of art?
Thank you, and hello to all my co-panelists. Thank you, Allison. I think that the debate is huge and way beyond a few cases that are case studies that we see repeated again. And I think that your point about the media is really interesting. And then how the media makes these different works of art or objects or what we call cultural property or cultural heritage, in a sense, their own idols in a way that sometimes actually takes away from other parts of, say, what's happening in the Middle East of people, for instance. So they become, in a sense, the stories themselves. And I think it's a bigger picture of what is it that we're talking about, these objects, whether tangible or even intangible heritage, and who gets to decide what is important, right? And I think this idea of the expert we'll come back to, I think, later in the talk, but the sense of what culture is and what heritage is, in my mind so far, still dominated by a Western intellectual tradition. And those masterpieces that we fight so hard for and that are in the media so much are really decided by a particular group of people. And I'd be interested to see if we can talk about adding other voices to that dynamic.
Great. There's a lot that comes up there. And so we'll get to a lot of these issues as we go throughout. But let me ask, looting has been going on for centuries. It was sort of standard practice. It was accepted. It was expected throughout much of history for what would happen when in wartime. We all know the expression, to the victor go the spoils. But it seems that that's changed. And maybe I can throw that to you, Neil. What has changed here? I mean, are we moving away from a to the victor go the spoils kind of mentality? Is something new happening?
I think what's new is globalization. In the past, the trade was largely about the large, important pieces, the art treasures, if you like. What we see these days is everything has a price. We see very small objects for sale on the internet, which no one would have looked at decades ago. And this is all really a result of globalization described broadly. It's improved means of communication, improved means of transport, travel, political borders have come down. We have the internet, deregulation. It's so much easier now to trade in small objects, to buy small objects, to dig up small objects. So I think that's the major change we're seeing. We're seeing really the whole thing's gone down market and expanded in scope as a result of globalization.
So that returns to the question that I think Erin brings up that I could throw out just to the panel in general. Then who gets to decide which objects we're fighting over and what the value of those objects are and who should own them? Anybody want to take that? Oh. Anyone. For those of you who are muted, Sophie's raising her hand, so we'll throw it to Sophie.
Hi, hello. Yeah, well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, can you hear me? I think we should frame the question. We also have to be careful about when we talk about past looting and current looting, because those are, speaking as a lawyer, those are really dealt with differently, belong to different legal frameworks if you want to. I mean, what was maybe accepted or tolerated in the 19th century or 18th century and the spoils of war, even there is some legal discussion about spoils of war and the regulation of those spoils of war, what could be taken, what could not be taken. But this has really changed with the adoption of the 1954 Hague Convention and the 1970 UNESCO Convention. So what might have been acceptable before is not acceptable nowadays. And so the current looting, as Neil has described it, is dealt with differently than it was before. So that's what I want to say is, we have different questions, different legal issues with those aspects of looting, past looting or historical looting, and the current looting that is taking place now.
Okay. Well, could you then, so you referred to the Hague Convention in the 50s, and what are some of the other legal frameworks that are defining what people have to work with when they need to make a claim for a work of art or argue for restitution, at least in terms of international law?
Well, these are very complex questions because every state has its own rules. We have international conventions, but the international conventions that have not been ratified by every country. So only the countries that have ratified those conventions are bound by them. The convention that is the first one, the 1954 convention, only deals with the protection of cultural property in time of war, and its aims is mainly to stop looting and to protect cultural property, so protect museums and avoid or stop people, soldiers mainly, from looting artifacts. Yep, that's,
Okay, we can get into some more details as we move forward because there's so many different kinds of issues that we're going to tackle, I think. But let me ask, and maybe Susan, maybe I can throw this question to you. What's at stake for museums in this debate? In terms of what kinds of economic impacts are we thinking we might see?
Well, this is a multi-layered question too, because there are museums that have sort of identified what they feel the economic impacts will be, but the world of museums is extremely diverse, right? And so we have huge numbers of things other than the large museums that you've already made reference to, who might be taking a very different stance, partly because they're serving different communities, and also because their service community might be the same thing as their source community. In other words, there are a number of museums out there who hold objects and are stewards of objects for people who identify themselves as the descendants of the makers of those objects, and those will create very different situations, right? So if we look at, for example, some of the stuff that James Kuno has written about, and if we look at some of the stances that some representatives of the British Museum have taken, the idea is that if we start to give back an antiquity, all the antiquities go, and then we have nothing for people to come and see, right? I would argue that this is not necessarily a slippery slope, and that we have lots of cases of small to mid-sized museums who have done some kind of repatriation, and it does not lead to the repatriation of all of their holdings, right? So to me, it's like I said, it's a multi-layered problem, because it's not so much, there's this perception of an economic impact, and that's something that I don't think has been measured or estimated. But there are a number of other factors in here too, which have to do with the relationships of museums to the people who have a stake in them, right? Both those people who visit and people who are represented by that museum in particular ways. So I would think about and worry about the status of museums along a number of different dimensions, as well as economic. Not a simple answer, I know. So.
No, there's no simple answers here, and the questions are very broad, but let's try to dig down into them a little bit. Can we maybe boil, so based upon some of your answers, I'm wondering, can we boil this debate down to a conflict between two approaches, a kind of cultural internationalism versus a cultural nationalism, a kind of, attempt at a universal museum that Kuno is defending versus a kind of national heritage museum, which would preserve just, local slices of cultural heritage?
Yeah, I think that it's not necessarily just sorry.
Go ahead.
Was that?
Go ahead.
I don't think it's necessarily just a binary, right? That happens, and we see it a lot in the literature, this division between sort of this notion of a universal museum and national museums. But there are a number of museums that I don't think frame themselves as national museums either, right? That they're actually representing a subsection of something that we would think of as nation. The difficulty is that conventions and laws have been framed mostly at international and national levels. And so when museums are operating at what we might call a regional level, or dealing with a subpopulation, it's hard to figure out where they fit within this debate.
Neil, did you have a comment?
Yes, I think that debate, the cultural nationalism, cultural internationalism debate, or dichotomy, I think it's very, it's very dangerous, because it's trying to restrict debate, really. It's trying to keep us talking about the cultural aspects of the problem. For example, are the Parthenon marbles better seen in the British Museum because more people will come? Are they better seen in Athens because that's where they come from? Are they better cared for in the British Museum? Are they better cared for in Athens? What it ignores is the politics of the situation, the history of the situation, the sense of grievance that countries such as Greece have, the feeling that they're not being treated as sovereign equals on the international stage. So if we try to frame the debate in terms of cultural nationalism, and cultural internationalism, we're effectively missing out a large part of the problem, the historical context, and the sense of grievance that lots of these countries have. That's my bit. Did you hear that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So did you have something to add?
Yeah, well, I agree with what has been. Sorry, I agree with what has been said, and I suppose as well, it's not black or white. It's a lot of it is a grey area, and I suppose there is a need for the art market. There is an art market because cultural internationalism is all everything is free, everything can be bought. Cultural nationalism, everything should be controlled and stay within the state. And this is not, it's not one or the other. There is an art market and it should be controlled, it should be regulated. So how far is it regulated really is the question. How can we have a fair or fairer art trade of cultural objects or art and antiquities, really? I think that's one of the important questions as well.
No, I mean, I think that does bring up a great question, but it brings us back to the point of who decides. Who decides what the regulation should be? Because this is a kind of, crosses borders. It's an international market. So who is going to make those determinations for what those regulations should be and for when things are repatriated and when they're not?
Right, the idea of I think specifically the UNESCO Convention as sort of, in a sense, putting forth the nationalism and sort of, in a sense, making what happens come from those as being the national side rather than the international side. And something I think that the idea of the museum and the audience is really interesting. So, inserting the idea of the individual in a sense here too, and how people experience art is a really difficult word, deciding what that is. But objects in a museum as being more than economics. So we're talking about the art market, but then also outside of hard economics, what are the stakes? I think it's really interesting.
So one question that I keep coming back to is, and I'm going to try to come at it in a different way. When we're thinking about who decides, when you look at some of the claims that have been made, especially by, say, Aboriginal groups, indigenous groups who are, looking for heritage objects to be returned to them. Many people have celebrated this as this kind of democratization effort. There's these democratizations of claims of art, of who owns art, and that has great value. But what role then do we have for preservers of the past? Is there a sort of role for that? Is there a role for a kind of expert in determining what makes value and what makes something an art object? Or are we just leaving it up to when people say that it's valuable to them? Susan?
Can I go ahead and talk? All right.
Sure.
So I think one of the things that's going on is if you actually look, for example, at the way that NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was applied in the United States. And I'm not a legal expert, but I did NAGPRA with a number of tribal groups. It's a set of legislation, and it lays out both policy and procedure for how one carries out repatriation, and it sets a number of criteria in the regulations that you have to assess, right? And I think there are a couple points to be made with respect to the application of at least that set of law, and one is that the relationship to indigenous peoples in North America is defined in terms of sovereignty. So we can't seem to get away from the idea of nations. And additionally, that it only applies to tribes that are federally recognized, right? So it doesn't get away from people who have group identities, but that don't fit this sort of definition of sovereignty or displacement in U.S. law and history. So this really is sort of a hairy issue in terms of who decides, in terms of who assigns valuations. Okay. But this brings us to some things that you raised in your email about this notion of cultural property, right? Because we are kind of stuck with dealing, operating in legal frameworks that are defined or based on common law and civil law. And there's notions of ownership tied up with this that in some cases are extremely foreign to the peoples who feel they have a stake, right, in that material or in that heritage, including intangible heritage. And so the question to me is, are there ways in which we can incorporate these sort of what we might call alternative epistemologies, right? These alternative ways of knowing and these alternative ways of viewing the world, or do we just continue to, try to operate through expediency and use sort of the laws that are there, right, and the definitions of sovereignty that are there?
So whose responsibility would that be? Would that be the responsibility of museums or of policymakers? What are museums doing at this point? Let's kind of back up. What sorts of steps have museums taken to try to recognize these different epistemologies?
Well, I mean, one of the things museums have to do, right, is comply with the laws of the countries in which they're located, right, and comply with a variety of conventions, right? So, for example, in the United States, museums are complying with things, if they receive any federal funding at all, which includes essentially some tax breaks, then they comply with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Okay. Additionally, they comply with things like the Endangered Species Act, and so museums do have, in the United States, for example, do have sets of regulations that are trying to comply with these, with both federal and it's, to some extent, state law. Right, so they are themselves not necessarily deciding, though they often will lobby policymakers. Okay. If we look across other areas of the world, of course, there's a lot of variability in sort of where the decision making happens, and part of that has to do with how centralized and strong, for example, a Ministry of Culture is.
So if we take, for example, the Native American Zuni tribe in New Mexico, who was able to successfully use these U.S. federal laws to get many of their artifacts returned by American museums, they're seeking the return of artifacts that they claim have sacred meaning to them from European museums as well, but because those European museums are not bound by any U.S. legislation, they're having less success. So I wonder, Sophie, what kinds of recourse would a Native American tribe have with museums in France and Germany who are holding artifacts?
I cannot talk about German museums because I'm not I don't know about German law enough to talk about it. Regarding French museums, and I suppose one can say first that the fact that the object is sacred object, the sacred objects are not recognized as a particular category of objects in French law or in English law, as far as I'm aware. So they're just objects. So they can be cultural objects, but they're just objects. If they are in a French museum, as such, they certainly belong to the French state, and all objects that are found in French museums are cannot be deaccessed, or there is a process to deaccess them, but it's a very narrow process that is very rarely used. It hasn't been used really much, as far as I'm aware. There was the case of the Hopi masks, so by the Hopi tribe in one of the American tribe that was who claimed the return of approximately, I think, 100 artifacts that were sold in an auction in Paris. Their claim was unsuccessful for several reasons, and one of the reasons is that this category of sacred objects was recognized. So they were just claiming objects that had been taken or stolen 100 years ago, and according to French law, they had just become the property. Those objects were the property of the current owner, and there was nothing that they could do to have those objects returned to them. It just it would be the same as a car, or the same as, I don't know, a pen. There's nothing, a Hopi mask from a pen. whether it is stolen or looting, or it's just the same law that applies now. So
So to go to a different example that I think has a little bit more sort of internationally applicable laws that at least we've tried for some kind of semblance of international concurrence. We can look at Nazi-era looted objects, which have generated a lot of this kind of international accords and conventions. And in 1998, the U.S. Department of State sponsored the Washington Conference Principles on Nazi-Confiscated Art, which among the non-binding principles that came out of that were the assertions that, I'm going to read them out because I think they're telling. One, art that has been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted should be identified. Also, every effort should be made to publicize art that is found to have been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted in order to locate its pre-war owners or their heirs. And, quote, steps should be taken expeditiously to achieve a just and fair solution. Now, again, they're non-binding, but they're principles that a lot of the major European countries agreed to, with, of course, under this US-led effort. And it sets up a very proactive system, which would be initiated equally by both the museums and the pre-war owners and their heirs. So if we go to that specific case of kind of Nazi-era looted objects, how have museums in the US and the Europe done in living up to these principles, sort of identifying these and actively looking for their real owners, looking for the provenance and when there are gaps in the provenance?
I think that, it totally changed the way provenance was thought of, and has absolutely amped up the idea of ethical provenance searching, and from acquiring works of art to the works of art that are in collections, and also the sort of ideas of standards of provenance, so what kind of information is wanted for provenance. And then I think that it comes down to realities in the sense of staffing in a museum, to have a provenance specialist, in every single museum. It's obviously big museums, perhaps, I know MoMA, etc. But not every museum, I think, can afford that. And this is something actually really interesting to turn to. So there's a really exciting project here in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Museum of Art called Art Tracks that has been set out to establish a more robust set of standards for provenance, and it's actually an open source software that they're designing that could ideally be shared across museums, and then have this different provenance matched in the sense, and then track it. So it's called Art Track. So track an object from ideally however much information you can get from where it is now to its creation, and then it shows this in a visual way, in an interactive way. So I know projects like that where there is a real effort to marry the sort of ideals and these wants, and then on the ground as well. So I think it's museums are aware of it in a real way.
Anyone else want to weigh in on responses to the Washington conference?
Yeah. I'm happy. Well, I suppose if we look at the situation in France, it was very special because France was an occupied country at the time, so there had been extensive looting, but not so much of public collections. We're not talking looting of French museums. We're talking about looting of private Jewish property mainly. So many items were returned after the war. So what we find now is many items that have slipped through the net. And the particularities of France as well is that there are more than 2,000 paintings and sculptures and other works of art and artifacts that have not been returned to their Jewish owners because those owners have not been found, unfortunately. So now some French museums are the repository of those artifacts and are almost waiting for the owners to come forward, which seems to be quite unlikely now. But this research and the Washington principles in France were implemented with the creation of a commission, the Matteoli Commission, that actively looked into the looting of art, but not only of art. We're also talking about bank accounts in France. We're also talking about flats and estates, so all private property that had been looted at the time. So a lot has been done since the 1990s, not enough, and more is being done at the moment. For the situation in the UK, in 2000, the government created the Spoliation Advisory Panel that advises museums. So it's an ADR, so it's an alternative dispute resolution. So if a looted artifact is found in a museum and the owner is claiming for the return of this object, they usually go to the Spoliation Advisory Panel, and the panel will look at the circumstances of the dispossession, the circumstances of the acquisition, and the fairness of the solution. Is it fair or isn't it fair to return the artifact to its owner, to its original owner? And in some cases, the panel has decided that it was, and in others, it was not. For example, because the dispossession was not the result of Jewish persecution, but the result of bad financial investments that had nothing to do with the persecution. So in that case, the object was not returned, for example. And this as well, a special statute was passed in 2009 in order to allow for the deaccession of those artifacts, so that if the Secretary of State approves the decision of the advisory panel, then the museum is allowed to return the object. So a lot has been done and is being done to return those objects.
Thank you. Are there any? I wonder at this time if we have any questions in the audience. I don't want to run away with things. Yes. We have a question here.
Thank you all for enlightening a really complex, difficult subject. And I have a number of questions, but let me ask maybe the simplest one. With the passage of time and the extraordinary developments in technology that we all benefit from, including this session, and given the intractable nature of these counterclaims, isn't there a technological fix for this? Isn't there a way in which an object can reside in one location but be represented in the other in a very real way, video or holograms or somehow virtually represented, so that this issue of in whose building it actually sits might be solved technologically, or is that not feasible?
I would just like to say I think feasibility is perhaps not the main issue. I think that the idea and this idea of what things are called comes from this original, which is something I think is really quite problematic. And I think that the idea of having the original is what I think people would argue is at stake. So I think having a hologram or something would be really interesting. But I think a lot of people would outcry at the sense of where it actually is original. And I do this in quotes because I really don't like the word original. So.
We had a couple other hands raised. Neil, did you have, or Susan, did you have a comment?
Neil raised his hand first.
Oh, okay. Neil?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, this gets back to the central issue that lots of these ownership claims or repatriation claims, they're based on a sense of historical grievance. It was the circumstances of the taking which is important as much as the ownership of the objects themselves. So if we look at the British seizure of the Benin bronzes in the 1890s, I mean, that was a very symbolic moment. It was symbolic of the British colonization of Benin first and then Nigeria. When Nigeria gained independence, to my mind, it was a disgrace that they never received the Benin bronzes back as part of the independence agreement. In those circumstances, I think asking a country to accept a 3D model of an object is kind of adding insult to injury in a way. I think if we say to the British Museum, give the Parthenon marbles back to Greece and you'll get a 3D representation to replace them, I think that's fine. Not too sure the British Museum would agree to it. But I don't really think we should be saying to Greece, well, you're not going to get the Parthenon marbles back, but we'll give you this 3D representation of them instead. I think this kind of misunderstands the grievance, which underlies a lot of these claims. Finished.
Right.
Susan?
All right, thank you. Just to build on what Neil was saying, it's not just, I think, about the grievance, right? But it's sort of a behavior that suggests a change in direction of political relationships. But there are technologies so that we do have things represented in holograms. Some of these technologies are actually quite old. At the University of Illinois, we actually have a plaster cast of those Parthenon marbles. And we use it and show it and so on. But there are notions about authenticity and sometimes symbolic value attached to these artifacts, as well as addressing that kind of issue of grievance that Neil was talking about.
Okay.
No, I agree with what has been said. Yeah, I agree with what has been said. And the example of actually having a cast made of an object, this has happened in Switzerland, for example. I think it was a bell, if I'm not mistaken, has been returned to Japan, and to thank the town that returned the bell, then the Japanese authorities, the city council, forged the same bell and gave it to the Swiss county. And that created an exchange between the two countries. So yes, the original is now in Japan and the copy is now in Switzerland, but they have links. Whereas before the Swiss had the original, but had nothing to explain the context or had no cultural links with their Japanese counterpart. So I think there is something to say about creating copies and having some exchange linked with that copies. I think the notion of authenticity is flowed to some extent, can be flowed. I'm done.
My thinking, yeah. The idea of authenticity being a particularly, I think, modern idea. We have a whole, the last, I think, in this country, it's called the Hall of Architecture in the Carnegie Museum, that is an entire hall of casts, and casts as being an essential part of museums that were teaching tools. It's a long tradition. The idea of, I study Rome and Egypt, so the idea of Roman copies of ancient Greek originals, and again, I do this because the sense of using, emulating and using things that are outside of, a different tradition doesn't necessarily mean it's a copy. So the idea of authenticity is very flawed. But I do think what Neil was saying, in the sense of that it's deeper inside of a symbolic. I think someone else mentioned the idea of symbolic original. I think is perhaps where the might lie.
It's interesting because this was an attempt to resolve some of the problems that happened with the British Museum and the Aboriginal exhibit that they did last year, was to digitize a bunch of things so that, at least in terms of the parts of the argument that say that, it only gives people access if they're in London, was, to hope to broaden access using these kind of digitization and digital formulas. And then Kuno argues, of course, that what should happen is kind of more lending, right? That there should be more museums throughout the world, not just concentrated in the West, but more museums throughout the world who house things so that they're spread around, but then that they're lending, they're moving around so that more people have access. Would that answer some of these complaints? Maybe it doesn't. I guess it doesn't settle it on the sort of grievance issue that we still come back to.
I think that it could establish the connections. I think someone mentioned the partnerships. It could be really interesting. I do think that there are museums would likely put up logistical issues with how complicated it is to lend and how expensive it is, and insurance, and the idea of the Parthenon marbles actually moving, and whether or not they would be a target for some kind of destruction on their way, and how that danger doesn't necessarily outweigh the lending. But I think, personally, I think it could be really interesting connection building.
Well, just to add to that, there are It depends on country, but so in some cases, you know, the state owns the artifacts that are held in the museum. In the case of the United States, museums actually have to demonstrate that they have the legal right to hold every object in their collections. And so with lending, there is, you know, some of the issues include insurance, as mentioned. There may also be concern on the part of some museums that even though under their nation's law that they're considered to legally hold the object, if that doesn't hold across other nations where the object might be traveling, there would be fear of that, as well as this fear of targeting through, you know, sort of terrorist acts and things like that. So it's I guess it's sort of a nice idea, but I anticipate that there's a lot of resistance to it from sort of a bureaucratic aspect for museums.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Oh, sorry, Steffi, yes?
Well, I think we also have to see that in some respects, museums are really willing to lend objects if they get paid for it, or if they have some other financial sweetener in the deal. That would be obviously including insurance, paying for the insurance. Because one has to say there are lots of contemporary and you know, exhibitions that are sponsored by very important oil firms or other banks and so on, and those institutions, those temporary exhibitions travel the world and are usually big money making ventures. I mean, the Louvre lends its objects. The Musée d'Orsay, you know, is the main impressionist museum in Paris, lends its objects. The Louvre has created a big joint venture with Abu Dhabi, from the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, if I'm not mistaken. So some museums, even the French museum, that are traditionally more conservative, tend to join in those exchanges if they can get some funding from it.
Well, we're all in it for funding. I know about that one. Are there any other questions from any of the audiences? Okay, so I want to turn to sort of bring up to the issues that have been coming up most recently that kind of add a new dimension to this debate, and that is some highly publicized destructions of art, highly publicized lootings that have been happening in Afghanistan, in Syria, destructions of historical documents in Mali, in 2012, 2013, up until this past year. And how have those kinds, and you look at what happened, in the wake of the Paris attacks, France announces this kind of cultural mission to create concrete and operational measures to protect cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria through cooperation of European authorities, creating refuges and shelters for endangered cultural property, the naming and shaming of smuggling havens, and crackdown stricter laws against trafficking. So have recent events, has the rise of the Islamic State, has that changed the contours of the debate in meaningful ways? Neil?
I suppose I have to answer that one, don't I, really?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's altered the contours of the debate in a not a very helpful way. I mean, looting and trafficking is a global problem, and it demands a global response. What doesn't work is this one country at a time response. It's no use responding to Afghanistan when the next problem is going to be Iraq. It's no use responding to Iraq when the next problem is going to be Syria. It's no use responding to Syria when presumably, but hopefully not, there'll be another problem further down the line somewhere else. So we really need to tackle this as a global problem with a global response. All the publicity surrounding Daesh in Syria has tended to focus attention on what they're doing, really, and we need a response to what they're doing and ignore what everybody else is doing. And I really don't think that in the long term that's a very useful way to be going. Another thing which has added has been the deliberate destruction, the performative destruction even of historical monuments by Daesh. And, there's going to be a lot of writing about this, I think, and a lot of thinking about this in years to come. But I think it seems to me that what we're doing at the moment as an international community, we're coming out with a lot of rhetoric, we're coming out with a lot of outrage. There are a lot of high-profile politicians and cultural figures rushing to the television cameras, expressing their outrage at the barbarity of these actions, but very little's being done on the ground. There's very little implementation of any policy actions which is successful. And I think we need to be a lot calmer in our reaction to what's happening, a lot more considered in our reaction to what's happening, and actually do something and not just talk about it. So I think there's a great deal of reflection that needs to be done here, following on from Daesh. Yeah, it has changed the contours in certain respects, but as I say, I don't think it's done it in a very productive way. Finished.
Is it possible that it could result in some of those countries that never ratified the second protocol reinforcing the Hague Convention actually signing their names to something? I mean, is it going to at least maybe spur on greater international cooperation and commitment to that?
Are you asking me again?
Want to commit? Anybody want to go ahead and make a prediction there? Sophie,
I think
No, if Neil wants to.
If Neil, if you want it, you can have it.
Well, it may well do, but will that have any material effect on the ground? That's the question we need to be asking.
So,
Sophie?
The UK is looking into ratifying the 1954 convention. Seriously looking into ratifying it. So, fingers crossed they're going to ratify it. And this hopefully would change as well the way our trade operates, because that's what, to jump on what Neil said, it's right. We don't need a country by country approach. We need a global approach. And one way to look at it would be to regulate the art trade for art dealers, for example, to be more diligent and look more in more detail into the history of the object they're selling. So that would be some progress, I think. And as for boots on the ground to protect cultural heritage, the UNESCO was looking into, or had some hopes to create an equivalent to the Red Cross, but like a Blue Cross or something like that would help protect cultural heritage on the ground. But the problem is that the UNESCO doesn't have much money and doesn't have the authority to create such force or a force, or that would protect cultural heritage more. They can only encourage countries to protect cultural heritage, but they cannot do much themselves.
So obviously, I think that's great to identify things that could be done more substantially, the sort of regulation of art trade, the protection of cultural heritage, can we get boots on the ground? But what I'm wondering if we're looking at how it might have changed the debate, has it perhaps given new resonance to the idea that the museums that exist currently can protect art and cultural heritage better than if they're repatriated to countries where there are wars or potential for wars and natural disasters? Oh, Susan?
Yeah, no, I would point out that museums in the United States and elsewhere are as easily blown up as the ones that have been blown up so far, unfortunately. So, I think structuring that museums are safe havens for objects is a little bit idealistic. And, this framing of if something gets repatriated, it's sort of automatically in danger is not necessarily correct. So I do think that we've seen the acceleration of the destruction of heritage, even with sort of the conventions and the laws that are in place. And while we know that UNESCO is strapped for cash, there is something to be said about thinking about some kind of transnational responses, because people on the ground in the country where stuff is happening are often worrying about just staying alive or feeding their children, right? Rather than enforcing laws that are on their books, even if they're signatories on a convention, right? So that we perhaps thinking of it as sort of there being helplines that cross borders might be an effective way to move forward on that.
Are there any other suggestions for how we move forward? Because we're coming up to our hour. And it looks like we're closing. But I wanted to give people a last chance to get any ideas raised that they wanted to see raised. And I most certainly want to thank you all for participating, for joining in the conversation, for lending us your expertise and helping us to understand this big and complicated issue. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.